The Grand Trunk Western Railroad Company is an important American subsidiary of the Canadian National Railway operating in Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. Since a corporate restructuring in 1971, the railroad has been under CN's subsidiary holding company, the Her Trunk Corporation. Her Trunk Western's routes are part of CN's Midwest Division. Its primary main line between Chicago, Illinois, and Port Huron, Michigan, serves as a connection between railroad interchanges in Chicago and rail lines in eastern Canada and the northeastern United States. The railroad's extensive trackage in Detroit and across southern Michigan has made it an essential link for the automotive industry as a hauler of parts and automobiles from manufacturing plants. Early history. Her Trunk Western grew out of a collection of rail lines which included Bay City Terminal Railway, Chicago, Detroit and Canada Grand Trunk Junction Railroad, Chicago and Her Trunk Railway, Chicago, Kalamazoo and Saginaw Railway, Chicago and Kalamazoo Terminal Railroad, Chicago and Lake Huron, Chicago and Northeastern, Detroit Grand Haven and Milwaukee Railway, Detroit and Huron Railway, Grand Rapids Terminal Railroad, Michigan Airline Railway, Muskegon Railway and Navigation Company, Peninsula Railway of Michigan and Indiana, Pontiac Oxford and Northern Railroad, Toledo Saginaw and Muskegon Railway. Mainline. Her Trunk Western began as a route for the Grand Trunk Railway of Canada to link its line to Chicago through Lower Michigan. GTR's objective was to have a mainline from shipping ports in Portland, Maine to rail connections in Chicago through southern Ontario and Quebec that would serve Toronto and Montreal. In 1859, the Grand Trunk completed its route to Sarnia, Ontario and began a ferry service across the St Clair River to Port Huron. GTR would lease the Chicago, Detroit and Canada Grand Trunk Junction Railroad to reach Detroit and from the would then run over the Michigan Central Railroad's line from Detroit into Chicago. It was on the line from Port Huron to Detroit that a 12-year-old Thomas Edison held his first job as a newsboy and candy butcher on board passenger trains. Her Trunk would establish its own route to Chicago across Michigan when the New York Central Railroad's William Henry Vanderbilt took over control of the Michigan Central in 1878. GTR sought to put together a route by acquiring 3 railroads that had already been sending some of its Chicago-bound trains on since 1877. The Chicago and Lake Huron Railroad, the Chicago and Northeastern Railroad and the Peninsula Railway of Michigan and Indiana together formed a direct route from Port Huron through Flint and Lansing, Michigan to Valparaiso, Indiana, where it connected into Chicago on the Pittsburgh, Fort Wayne and Amp, Chicago Railroad. However, Vanderbilt owned the Chicago and Northeastern section of the route from Flint to Lansing and would charge Her Trunk higher rates to move its freight over the line. Vanderbilt would soon sell the C and Amp to Her Trunk when GTR bought the other 2 lines in 1879 and proposed building its own route between Flint and Lansing just north of Vanderbilt's line. Her Trunk completed its own route into Chicago from Valparaiso in 1880 and incorporated the entire line from Port Huron to Chicago as the Chicago and Grand Trunk Railway. More routes. Over the next 2 decades, through either leases or purchases, Grand Trunk would acquire several other branch lines in Michigan. It would take control of the Michigan Airline Railway through a lease in 1881. The line connected with the Chicago, Detroit and Canada Grand Trunk Junction at Richmond, Michigan and ran to Jackson, Michigan through Romeo and Pontiac. When Her Trunk purchased the Great Western Railway in 1882, it also acquired the Detroit Grand Haven and Milwaukee Railway, which Great Western had owned since 1877. The DGH&M gave her trunk a route from Detroit through Pontiac, Durand and Grand Rapids to Grand Haven, Michigan, where it would begin its Lake Michigan railcar ferry operations in 1902. The DGH&M would connect with the Chicago and her trunk at Durand and with the Chicago, Detroit and Canada Grand Trunk Junction in Detroit. Durand would become a major junction point for her trunk when it continued to increase its mileage. It acquired the 96-mile Toledo, Saginaw and Muskegon Railway from Ashley, Michigan to Muskegon, Michigan in 1888. GTR would obtain trackage rights to reach the line at Ashley from Owosso, Michigan with the Toledo, Ann Arbor and North Michigan Railway, the predecessor of the Ann Arbor Railroad. Her trunk acquired a route into Saginaw, Michigan in 1890 with the lease of the Cincinnati, Saginaw and Mackinac Railroad from Durand to Bay City, Michigan. The line was the last to be held as a leased property until January 1943, when it was fully merged into her trunk Western Division. By 1900, her trunk would unite the operations of the Chicago and Grand Trunk Railway and all of its lines in Michigan, Illinois and Indiana under a subsidiary company called the Grand Trunk Western Railway Company. The name derived from the fact that GTR's rail lines west of the St Clair and Detroit rivers were referred to as its Western Division. The lines had also operated under the name her trunk railway system. Pontiac also continued to become another important junction point when the Pontiac, Oxford and Northern Railroad was acquired in 1909. It ran north from Pontiac to Caseville in Michigan's Thumb region. By 1910, GTW would have a network of trackage connecting all of Lower Michigan's major manufacturing cities when it acquired a lease on a short branch of the Chicago, Kalamazoo and Saginaw Railroad, giving it access to Kalamazoo, Michigan. A few years before, in 1902, GTW had gained access into Ohio with its shared ownership of the Detroit and Toledo Shoreline Railroad. The line was a small carrier that had a multi-track mainline bridging Detroit and Toledo, Ohio, and was purchased equally by GTW and the Toledo, St. Louis and Western Railroad, a predecessor of the Nickel Plate Road. GTW eventually took complete control of the line when it bought Nickel Plate's half-interest from its successor Norfolk and Western Railway in 1981. Terminal Railroads. Her trunk Western also owned a co-owned terminal switching railroad companies in some of the cities it operated in. Beginning in 1905, it co-owned equal shares of the Detroit Terminal Railroad with New York Central. By the 1970s, Detroit Terminal was suffering financial losses and GTW negotiated to sell its share to NYC's successors Penn Central and Conrail until it dropped its ownership in 1981. In Grand Rapids, Michigan, it acquired the Grand Rapids Terminal Railroad in 1906. In Bay City, Michigan, it owned the Bay City Terminal Railway, and in Kalamazoo it took over the nearly 3-mile-long Chicago and Kalamazoo Terminal Railroad by 1910. Prior to moving its ferry operations to Muskegon, GTW also acquired the Railway Beltline Muskegon Railway and Navigation Company in 1924. The company would exist as a GTW subsidiary until 1955. For its entry into Chicago, GTW, along with the Erie, Wabash, Chicago and Eastern Illinois and Monon Railroads, was a co-owner of the Chicago and Western Indiana Railroad beginning in 1883. It performed passenger and express car switching duties at Chicago's Dearborn Station. GTW was also part of a group that created and shared ownership in the Belt Railway Company of Chicago that connects every rail line in the Chicago area. Canadian National. By 1919, GTW's parent, her Trunk Railway of Canada, was suffering financial problems related to its ownership of the Her Trunk Pacific Railway. The Canadian government nationalized Her Trunk and other financially troubled Canadian rail companies by 1923 and amalgamated them into the new, government-owned entity, the Canadian National Railway. GTW would become a subsidiary of the new entity and was reincorporated as the Her Trunk Western Railroad Company on November 1, 1928, when nearly all of its lines were formally merged under the company. River Tunnel. GTW's predecessor, Her Trunk Railway, also sought to expedite its rail service between Port Huron and Sarnia by constructing the world's first international submarine rail tunnel under the St Clair River. The St Clair Tunnel, completed in 1891, approximately 6,000 feet long and hand-dug, allowed Her Trunk to discontinue its ferry service across the river. The tunnel was the last link in GTR's complete mainline from Chicago through southern Canada. In 1992, Canadian National began construction of a new, larger tunnel next to the original tunnel to accommodate double-stacked intermodal containers and tri-level auto carriers used in freight train service. The new tunnel was completed in 1994 and dedicated on May 5, 1995. GTW also gained trackage rights in 1975 to use Penn Central's Detroit River Tunnel between Detroit and Windsor, Ontario. Penn Central's successor Conrail sold the tunnel to CN and Canadian Pacific Railway in 1985. Eventually, CN sold its share of the Detroit Tunnel in 2000 after the new St Clair Tunnel was completed. The railroad's first major line abandonment came in 1951 when it abandoned about half of the former Toledo, Saginaw and Muskegon Railway line from Muskegon to Greenville, Michigan. That same year, Her Trunk Western bought its headquarters building at 131 West Lafayette Avenue in downtown Detroit. At the end of 1970, GTW operated 2,154 miles of track on 946 miles of road, and that year it reported 2,732 million net revenue ton-miles of freight, and 49 million passenger miles. Her Trunk Corporation. After several years of Canadian National subsidizing the financial losses of Her Trunk Western, a new holding company would be established by CN in 1971 to manage GTW. The Grand Trunk Corporation was created to shift full control of GTW operations to Detroit and begin a strategy to make the railroad profitable. CN's other American properties, the Central Vermont Railway and the Duluth, Winnipeg and Pacific Railway, would also be placed under the new corporation initially for tax purposes. With the new corporation came a new autonomy for GTW from its parent CN. Her Trunk Western had always shared equipment, color schemes and corporate logos with Canadian National. It shared CN's Herald styles with its own name on the previous tilted Herald and maple leaf logos. In 1960, when CN launched its new image, GTW had its own initials incorporated into the wet noodle logo and followed with CN's black, red, orange and gray locomotive color scheme. However, to show its new autonomy from CN in 1971, GTW began receiving its new locomotives in its famous bright blue, red, orange and white scheme. Most of GTW's freight cars also received the blue and white color scheme. With new management, the railroad implemented a new strategy to market shippers and improve its performance. In 1975, the railroad adopted its company slogan, "The Good Track Road." This slogan promoted GTW's truck maintenance efforts, at a time when many Eastern and Midwest railroads suffered from deferred maintenance. The company also encouraged better safety practices, which earned it the E.H. Harriman Award for Safety 5 times in the 1980s. DT and AMP-I merger, part of the railroad's new strategy in the 1970s and 1980s, was to seek new routes to expand and compete in the long-haul railroad market. After Conrail took over the railroad operations of Penn Central in 1976, the Penn Central Corporation sought to divest itself of its subsidiary, the Detroit, Toledo and Ironton Railroad. After petitioning the Interstate Commerce Commission (GTW) on approval over a joint bid from Norfolk and Western and Chassis System to acquire the DT and AMP-I in June 1980. The acquisition increased GTW's trackage around Detroit's industries, including Ford Motor Company's large River Rouge complex, DT and AMP-I's classification hump yard in Flat Rock, Michigan, and route south into Ohio with access to rail interchanges in Cincinnati, Ohio. As part of the ICC's approval, GTW was obligated to divest its half by Norfolk and Western's share in the Detroit and Toledo shoreline. It purchased N and AMP-W's share in April 1981 for $1.9 million and completely merged the line into GTW later that same year. The Milwaukee Road. Her trunk Western sought to further expand its trackage by seeking to purchase one of the bankrupt Midwest railroads, the Milwaukee Road of the Rock Island, of the 1970s. After inspecting the Rock Island's property and finding its trackage in need of costly repairs, GTW turned its attention in 1981 to acquiring the Milwaukee Road. GTW saw the acquisition of the Milwaukee Road as an opportunity to expand its route further south and west to rail interchanges in Kansas City, Missouri and Louisville, Kentucky. It would also afford GTW the opportunity to connect directly with its corporate cousin the DW and AMP-I at Duluth, Minnesota. Instead of initially placing a bid for the Milwaukee Road and seeking immediate ICC approval, GTW embarked on a strategy to improve the line's revenue and track maintenance. GTW and Milwaukee Road would enter into a voluntary coordination agreement where GTW would direct more of its shipments over the Milwaukee Road's route. It would also launch a marketing effort promoting the merger. However, as the Milwaukee Road became more successful, two other potential bidders, the Soo Line Railroad and the Chicago and Northwestern Railway, petitioned the ICC to purchase the railroad. Despite GTW's efforts, the ICC rejected its bid and, after a further bidding war between the Soo and the C in AMP-NW, approved of the Soo Line's acquisition of the Milwaukee Road, and the two roads were merged in January 1986. Improving efficiency and downsizing. During the 1970s and 1980s, Grand Trunk Western would continue to improve its efficiency and embark on efforts to improve its operating ratio. It had consolidated some of its operations, including dispatching in Pontiac, locomotive maintenance in Battle Creek and railcar maintenance in Port Huron. Its intercity passenger train operations would be handed over to Amtrak in 1971. Responsibility for GTW's commuter rail operation in Detroit was turned over in 1974 to the Regional Transportation Authority (SEMTA). GTW moved into the intermodal freight business by creating intermodal transfer yards in Chicago in 1975 and suburban Detroit. In 1978, The railroad's president at the time, John H. Burdakin, was also a proponent of the automatic car identification system. It was a means to identify the location of shipments and equipment with barcode labels on the sides of freight cars and locomotives. The labels were read by automatic scanners at various rail yards. When Conrail was formed in 1976, GTW sought to acquire some of its routes in Michigan. It gained 151 miles of trackage between Saginaw and Bay City, as well as near Muskegon and Midland, Michigan. Several of GTW's cuts in its expenditures came from reductions in its workforce through changes it negotiated in union work rules. In 1978 it discontinued its Lake Michigan railcar ferry operations after consecutive years of financial losses over $1 million. By 1987 the company sold its headquarters building on Lafayette Avenue in Detroit and moved to the new office park complex Bree Park. The complex was developed on the site of the former Stroh's Brewery near downtown Detroit. Locomotive performance was also enhanced with a rebuilding program of its CMDGP-9S. By the 1990s several miles of routes and facilities were abandoned or sold to regional rail companies. GTW would eliminate all of the former Pontiac Oxford and Northern Line north of General Motors' Lake Orion manufacturing plant by 1985. In 1987 the former Cincinnati, Saginaw, and Mackinac and the former Detroit Grand Haven, and Milwaukee routes north of Durand were sold to the Central Michigan Railway, Elsdon Yard. GTW's primary terminal and rail yard in Chicago had been downsized and closed by 1990. It had also sold almost the entire route of the Detroit, Toledo and Ironton in 1997 to the shortline rail operator Railtex. By 1998 it had abandoned the entire former Michigan airline route except for a portion in Oakland County, Michigan it sold to Co-Rail. With the end of SEMTA commuter rail service to downtown Detroit in 1983, GTW abandoned and sold its trackage from the Milwaukee Junction area to downtown Detroit. That line was the former route to Brush Street Station and its railcar ferry dock on the Detroit River. It is known as the DeQuinta Cut, which has been transformed into an urban greenway rail trail. By the year 2000 engine terminals and maintenance facilities had also been eliminated or downsized in Chicago, Detroit, Durand, Pontiac, Port Huron and Battle Creek. CN North America. In December 1991, Canadian National announced a corporate image and restructuring program to consolidate all of its U.S. railroads under the CN North America brand. Her Trunk Western along with other CN-owned subsidiaries would see their images replaced with the CN logo and name. All GTW corporate identification and that of its new corporate cousins, the Illinois Central Railroad and Wisconsin Central Limited, are referred to with CN's name and corporate image. However, while each railroad's locomotives would eventually receive CN's logo and black, red, orange and white paint scheme, they would still retain the respective reporting marks. Despite the corporate rebranding, GTW's blue color scheme and its logo would persist on rolling stock and locomotives for several years while they are slowly either repainted or retired. CN also reintegrated managerial and some operational control of GTW as it would gradually shift out of Detroit and into CN headquarters in Montreal. GTW would continue to maintain some office and dispatching functions from offices in suburban Troy, Michigan. All the routes that make up GTW are part of CN's Midwest division in its Michigan zone. Her Trunk Corporation, now formerly headquartered at CN in Montreal, is the holding company for almost all of CN's U.S. properties, which include Grand Trunk Western, Illinois Central, Wisconsin Wisconsin Central, Duluth, Winnipeg and AMP, Pacific and Great Lakes Transportation, which includes the Bessemer and AMP, Lake Erie Railroad and the Duluth, Mississippi and Iron Range Railway. The Association of American Railroads has considered the Grand Trunk Corporation as a single non-operating Class I railroad since 2002. Her trunk, Western, still exists as a corporate entity but can now be considered a company on paper. CN refers to GTW's roots and operations in its corporate communications as the former Her Trunk Western Territory.